So hi everyone, I'm John Plant. I am on the LP Mass State Committee. I was reelected today, obviously, again, so all good stuff here. So I'm going to introduce Jeff Miron. As an economist in training myself, I am very proud to have Jeff here to give us a talk. He's going to be talking about our fiscal policy issues that we have, some joint policy. Okay, I'm gonna let him tell you what he's gonna say. Scratch that. I assume we're all made monetary policy. Okay, anyway. So to give you a little bit of a background on Jeff, Jeff went to Swarthmore College. He got a BA in economics, went to MIT for his PhD in econ. Now he's a professor, and you are the director of undergraduate econ at Harvard. That's correct. Okay, that's good. And also works at Cato and has written Cato and also the Foundation for Economic Education. Am I missing anything about you?
He's got a great blog.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, he's got a really good
Actually, one more thing that I would want to say is he was elected to the LP National Platform Committee. You got the most votes of everyone else. If you guys did not see that, that's absolutely amazing. So again, I will turn it over to Jeff, and he'll give you a talk about economics.
Sorry for the slight delay. So I also apologize to John if I told you I was going to talk about something specific, because I forgot about whatever I said to you, so I'm just going to talk about something else. So as I was preparing my remarks and read them over this morning before I got here, I thought, God, that's really boring. They're not going to get a lot of strong reaction. What you're going to talk about is sort of too middle-of-the-roady, reasonable, whatever. And then I came in around 5 o'clock and started talking with people who were at the bar, and I remembered, which I should have remembered earlier, that you can say anything to a group of libertarians, and people are going to yell at you, scream at you, throw tomatoes at you, whatever. So I'm no longer worried that I won't generate any controversy. But that's part of what I love about libertarians, is whatever I say, I'm going to get a lot of grief. So interrupt, yell, scream, whatever. So the motivation for my talk is two pieces. Kids in there yelling bloody murder. Two pieces. Maybe they're future libertarians. First, basically everybody in this room is a libertarian. Okay? We think libertarianism makes eminent sense. It just seems natural, compelling to us. But our coworkers, our friends, our family, in most cases, don't just think we're a little confused. Some of them think we're crazy nuts. Some of them think we're super offensively evil. So that's a bit of a problem. Just to illustrate, at the economics department lunch at Harvard a few days ago, last week, the issue of gun control and the shooting in Las Vegas came up. And somebody who knows I'm a libertarian decided it would be fun to provoke me and make me look like an idiot and said, so, don't you at least agree that these semi-automatic weapons should be outlawed? And I said, well, that's kind of a crazy position, because that's equivalent to basically outlawing all weapons, because essentially every gun these days is a semi-automatic. And he said, well, okay, how about rocket launchers? And I said, well, I defy you to show me any evidence suggesting that banning rocket launchers would do any good thing, any beneficial thing. He said, well, nuclear weapons, okay? And it went on from there, and he managed to make me look like a complete crazy person in front of all the other people at lunch. And so we are not persuading, okay? We are not regarded as having sort of carried the day. There are all these people who think our views are just sort of incredibly off, and the trend doesn't seem to be in the right direction. Look at who's president. You have the most non-libertarian, anti-libertarian, totalitarian president for a long, long time. So despite the fact that we think libertarianism is so natural and so obvious, at one level we're losing. Okay? A different way of thinking about that is that when I give talks to students and various groups, the libertarians in the crowd will typically ask me something like, this sounds great, I really like all the policies you're endorsing. How can we win? Or when are we going to win? And typically, I will mumble something like, I'm an economist, I think about what policies are good or bad, I don't predict what the political outcomes are going to be, it's too hard to figure out how we can politically make progress on these issues. And so I sort of punt on the issue. But that's not very satisfying, because if we believe the things we believe, we need to think about how we can get more people to agree with us. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. So, sorry, this is really kind of distracting.
Dan will take care of it.
Did you guys sleep?
We're having a very important topic.
Maybe Dan sings.
We're outside.
There were about 10 like 8-year-olds playing
Hockey.
hockey. So it's a little loud. So my remarks are about how we might be able to be more persuasive. Okay? Not just in the political arena, but with our friends and our coworkers and things like that. I'm obviously not going to claim I have a solution to how we can be more persuasive. I'm kind of thinking out loud. I'm going to put out some ideas that I hope sort of resonate or make some sense. But I do want to emphasize it's an important thing for us to consider. You know, we all sit around arguing, as I was at the sort of table at dinner, about things which, you know, on the libertarian spectrum are, on the sort of non-libertarian spectrum, are between, you know, out here or out here, when most of the world is way over here someplace, and so we're kind of just preaching to the choir or arguing with each other over things that are sort of arcane, unless we can be more persuasive broadly. So I'm going to divide it up into 3 pieces. First piece is about our style of trying to persuade or to argue or to present our views. Okay? There's not a clean distinction between style and substance, but then the second piece will be about the substance. What issues I think should be really important to libertarians, that we should talk about a lot? How should we talk about them? Which ones, even though we might all agree in this room, we should keep a little quieter about because they're much harder sells and they're not going to do so well in the sort of court of public opinion. And then I want to talk about the issue of whether we should be watering down our views. Should we be soft pedaling our libertarian views in order to be more persuasive, or should we be doing something else? So on the question of sort of style, let's start with the fact, which has been evidenced just in the 2 hours I've been here today, 20 times. We are an argumentative lot. I paid him to say that. So, you put 2 people are sitting next to each other on an airplane, and they start chatting, and it turns out that they both have some libertarian leanings. And one of them says, yeah, I really think government is way too big. We should eliminate 98% of it. Guaranteed, the other person can say, what? Only 98%? Your totalitarian state has big you. And so we just are really, really difficult to be around because we just don't ever settle for half a loaf or making a little progress. We always want to disagree. A related point is we are extremely confident. We come across as being absolutely positive we're right about a whole set of issues. And my evaluation is the evidence really does not back us up in a nice, clean, robust way on some of these issues. Or there are a whole bunch of so-called experts who have credentials from top universities or appointments as the faculty members or all sorts of other credentials who think that we're completely wrong, and yet we act as though we're positive we know the answer. And that's sort of a tough sell. That makes people think that we're just sort of adamantly, addicted to some principle or some conclusion rather than being rational. So let me give some examples of that. Okay? Some of us, some libertarians, argue that tax cuts are going to unleash enormous economic growth. You actually have to work pretty hard to find academic journal articles by reputable economists that confirm that. Do they mildly tend to suggest that maybe tax cuts are good for growth? Yes. But do they in any way, shape, or form say we're going to unleash miraculous growth from tax cuts? Not even remotely close. Same thing for regulation. If you look at the rate of growth of US output over time, since roughly 1870, when we first started having data, the growth rate is basically a constant. It's 3% a year, every year from 1870 till almost the present. And yet, in the first 70, 80 years of that, there was essentially no regulation. And then starting from World War II on, there was tons of regulation, yet the rate of growth of GDP just didn't change. So that's a little confusing if you're confident that regulation is killing growth, stifling growth, is horrible for growth, horrible for the economy. So I think we're probably right that there are negative effects from all this regulation, but we shouldn't act as though this is a fundamental law of nature, as though it's God's truth, because it makes us look sort of unscientific and silly once people have looked sort of at the evidence. Many libertarians, including lots of my colleagues in various places, talk as though the Fed is the root of all evil in society. Okay? If you read Ron Paul's book about the Fed, okay, the fact that my 16-year-old left his wet towel from having showered on the floor of his bedroom is because of the Fed. Things that happened 1,000 years before the Fed was created were the fault of the Fed. That sort of overconfidence or exaggeration doesn't do us any good in terms of getting people to think that we're interesting, that we have a point of view, that we maybe should at least have a seat at the table in discussing public policy. We also tend to push really tough positions. We don't just say we should have less redistribution, government redistribution. We tend to push for zero government redistribution. We don't just push for less government spending on education or no federal involvement in education, but zero government spending or support of education. We don't just talk about legalizing marijuana. We say that all drugs should be legal, from ketamine to crack cocaine and so on. And in addition, they should be legally available to 8-year-olds, okay, for sale from anybody who wants to do it. Okay? That's a hard sell. That is really not going to win hearts and minds or get people who don't agree with us yet to think that we have something reasonable to say. We're not just for freer trade or a little bit more legal immigration. We're for absolutely open borders and so on and so forth. Okay? We're obsessed with slippery slopes. Okay? We think that just a few gun restrictions will inevitably lead, almost without any risk, without any inevitably to confiscation. And yet we look at lots of countries like the UK or Japan or other European countries that have a lot of gun regulation. And they don't quite have gun confiscation. They don't have government becoming super totalitarian and disarming the whole citizenry. So when we say these sorts of things, it makes people think that we're pushing way too hard and somehow discredits our message. I also think we don't distinguish enough between bad policies and really terrible policies. Is the Massachusetts ban on tattoo parlors a good policy? No, it's completely stupid. No one should ever be in favor of such a policy. But it's equivalent to outlawing marijuana or invading Iraq or all sorts of other really horrible policies? No. It's much less worse. It's one state, it's relatively easily avoided because when you cross the line from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, big surprise, there's a whole bunch of tattoo parlors right at that state line. So we don't make the distinction between policies always. We act as though any government intervention, any infringement on freedom or liberty is catastrophic, and that strikes a lot of people as so implausible that they tune out our whole message. A different problem for the way that we argue and the way that we present is our message is not optimistic. In a whole set of settings, our line is, or I think it should be, yes, private arrangements or private markets, they don't work so well. Okay? There's monopoly, there's externalities, there's public, there are all sorts of reasons why markets are sort of imperfect. But that's only half the question. The question is, are those imperfections better or worse than the government imperfections when they try to fix the market? And our view is the government always makes it worse. The treatment is worse than the disease. And therefore, if you're given a choice between A, the market, and B, the government intervening in the market, the right choice is A, even though that has all sorts of imperfections. We don't claim, we shouldn't claim, that if we legalize drugs, no one would ever overdose, okay, that there would be no problems with people's misuse of drugs. Of course there would be, because people misuse cars, they misuse coffee, they misuse alcohol, they misuse everything. So all those problems will exist in a legal market for drugs. We just think that prohibiting drugs make things worse, not better. It's not an optimistic message. People seem to want some third way, some magical different government policy that eliminates the bad parts of drug use, okay, and yet somehow avoids the bad parts of drug prohibition. Our view is that's just not possible, but it's not an optimistic message, it's a hard sell, okay, for most of the people we're trying to convince. Just a few other things on style. Libertarians as a group often act as though we hate government. We think anybody who works for the government sort of is an evil hack. Everyone trying to make government better is badly intentioned and all that. That's not going to make any friends or win any hearts and minds. Last but not least, I don't know if it's true of this group, but it's certainly true of libertarians, people who call themselves libertarians broadly. We're much tougher on the Democrats than the Republicans. And in my view, that's just completely wrong. The Democrats, terrible on the vast majority of issues, and the Republicans are terrible on the vast majority of issues. To a first approximation, they're just as bad. If we are more forgiving of Republicans than Democrats, it makes people think that we're not really being consistent and fully honest. So just thinking about style, okay, my view is part of the reason we're not persuading is because we're not arguing in effective ways. We're not thinking about how to win hearts and minds. And we could do better. We could be respectful and calm and talk to people as though we fully respect their motives, even though we disagree with their policy positions. Okay? We can attack messages and not messengers. We can disagree with ideas rather than the groups that are promoting their ideas. And we're not particularly good at that. I think Democrats are bad at that and Republicans are bad at that too, but we're not perfect at it either, and we should be better about that. So the style, I think, is part of our problem, but it's certainly not the whole story. So now let me think about substance. I'm going to talk about a bunch of specific policies and a few general sort of perspectives. Okay? The two general perspectives are, first, as I mentioned a second ago, we don't, as a group, and again, I don't think this room is necessarily guilty of this, but averaged over the whole country, I think there is an issue. We're harder on the right than on the left. Okay? We spend a lot more time focused on economic policies than on social and foreign policies, and therefore we end up looking like Republicans, or people suspect that we're really Republicans, that our motivations are mainly self-interest, okay? And that's very unfortunate. Okay? That issue, I think, does vary a lot across the libertarian audience, and I don't really know about this audience, but my view is that we should be focusing on the social issues, the foreign policy issues, at least as much as we focus on the economic issues, okay? And that would get a lot more people to take us seriously, to decide that even if they disagree, they should have us at the table. The other general thing that I think we could do better is talk about federal versus state policies. We could say very consistently, almost anything done at the federal level is a terrible idea. If those very same things are done at the state level, we don't like them. Massachusetts resident, you're going to vote against the minimum wage. As a Massachusetts resident, you're going to vote against Romney Care. All on down the line. But if the federal government got out of all of those issues, and states were competing for residents, okay, by adjusting their policies, if states had to worry that if they have overly generous welfare or an overly high minimum wage or overly onerous environmental regulation, the harm from those sorts of things would be much smaller, and we should sort of be willing to tolerate that because it would be much less disastrous than having the federal government involved in all those issues. So now let me talk about the specific things that I think we should be emphasizing, okay? And I think it's different than what, on average, libertarians are emphasizing. And again, I'm going to focus on the federal point, not so much on the state and local. Not in any particular order, okay? So I'm not ranking these, but one is foreign policy. Okay? We should be ranting incessantly about getting our troops out of other people's countries, about not invading Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, because foreign policy and interventions are extremely costly. It's not just the soldiers and the tanks and the guns and all that. It's the fact that we give the whole rest of the world a good reason to hate us. Okay? That's going to exacerbate terrorism carried out against Americans. It's going to exacerbate terrorism more generally. It's going to distort all sorts of other policies about privacy and things like that. Okay? So foreign policy should be one of the 5 or 10 things at the very top of our agenda. Immigration and trade. Okay? Libertarians are generally quite good about this, but I think we should be very clear that those two policies are front and center of what we believe. Okay? We should be welcoming everybody, we should be welcoming everybody's exports, and so on and so forth. Now, one that we unfortunately have to emphasize because it's so economically important, even though it makes us look like ogres or misers or like we want to throw granny out on the street, is entitlement spending. Entitlement spending is on a path to bankrupt the economy. Everybody serious agrees with that, okay? And it's humongous. It's not as though in the year 3 million spending on Medicare is going to be too big for us to afford. It's like in the year 2050, Medicare spending is going to be too big for us to afford. So even though that one is super unpopular, we have to talk about it because it's just humongous and will totally bankrupt the entire economy. Another one I would put very, very high on the list is drug prohibition. First, there's all the direct negative things that drug prohibition is doing, and it's not just marijuana. Indeed, at this point, it's mainly not marijuana. It's opioid prohibition, because all the people who are dying of opioid overdoses are mainly doing it because they don't have legal access to getting more opioids. What's the cure for opioid addiction?
Opioids.
Marijuana.
Exactly. It may be marijuana or something, but for most people, it's more opioids. And if they could get a legal supply of opioids and they knew the dosage and they didn't have to go to the black market and all that, they would stay on opioids for more years, more decades, maybe their whole lives, with basically no negative effects. So it's opioid prohibition that's a crucial negative, a crucial cause of the opioid epidemic. And so we have to take a stand on that. In addition, it's hard to imagine having a less racist, a less oppressive, a less excessive criminal justice system unless you repeal drug prohibition. Okay, so for all of those reasons, and reasons which would gain us credibility and gain us brownie points with the left as opposed to the right, we should be focusing on that because that's the key starting point in demilitarizing local police, in getting the police not to have any authority to stop or arrest or detain most people, because they don't have this thing they can just make up and say, you look like a drug dealer, so I can arrest you. You look like you might have a joint in your pocket, so I can stop and frisk you and all that sort of thing. No drug prohibition, a lot of that becomes much more difficult. Last on my list, because it's important, I think, to talk about education, we should be talking about zero federal role in education. No subsidies, no loan guarantees, no, anything on the buzzword, core curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? There's no good reason for it. The country grew enormously and people got educated for a long, long time before there was any federal role in education. There's just nothing good that can possibly come of it. But what are things where maybe we should either talk about them differently or downplay them or whatever? So one I already talked about, several I talked about, the Fed is the root of all evil. As an economist, my view is nobody knows anything about monetary policy, okay, or what's a good monetary system or not. All of us as libertarians who are positive the gold standard would be better, we don't really have much evidence. All of the mainstream macroeconomists who are positive that central banks are essential to good economic performance, they essentially have no evidence. We really know nothing. So that doesn't mean we can't be critical of the Fed or particular actions that Fed or other central banks take, but in fact, we shouldn't be positive we know anything about it, so maybe that's an issue where we just shut up, okay, or admit that we don't know anything more than anybody else does, and that way we don't avoid sort of antagonizing people who think they have strong views on that. A very different one is Obamacare. Okay, so Obamacare, we all agree, is a terrible law. It's a completely insane policy for a whole bunch of reasons. Okay, both sort of detailed ones of how messy and complicated it ended up being, but also in broad brush. Should the government be guaranteeing health insurance to everyone? I think most people in the room agree it should not. It should treat health insurance like any other good. People can afford it, get to buy it. But if we're going to rant about Obamacare, we should at least as much be ranting about Medicare. Because Medicare has most of all the same problems, and it's much bigger than Obamacare is now. In addition, Obamacare will probably stay roughly a constant percentage of GDP going forward, because Obamacare covers roughly people between poor and sort of poor. And with luck, that will be a reasonably stable fraction of the population for a long, long time. Medicare, by construction, is going to cover almost all of the population over time because eligibility is at 65. Its lifespan continue. Almost everybody's going to live way past 65. So Medicare is, by construction, going to be explosive, and Obamacare is not. So is it okay to criticize Obamacare? Of course, it's a terrible policy. But we should spend way more time on Medicare, even though as a political matter, that's a complete disaster. It's a total loser, because it's the only honest thing that we can say about that. One other suggestion on how we talk about things a little differently. Libertarians spend a lot of time criticizing proposals to redistribute more. Okay, progressive taxation, more generous welfare payments, and things like that. No disagreement with that whatsoever. But there's a whole other set of things that we don't talk about enough, which is all of the regressive regulation, all the crazy ways that government ends up redistributing in ways that have no correlation with common sense or with helping people who maybe have some plausible case to be helped. So barriers to entry into occupations, the fact that you have to go through all sorts of hoops to become a doctor or a lawyer, that's making those goods and services more expensive for everybody, especially people who are poor, obviously. And it's enriching a bunch of people who otherwise would have more modest incomes. If we focus on those, on all the bad ways that government is causing inappropriate redistribution, it gives us a good thing to push back against the people who just want more progressive taxation or things like that. Okay, so summarizing on substance, excuse me. Obviously, there's tons of room for people to disagree with what I've emphasized or what I particularly think is sort of the right way to present our views. Okay? I'm pushing consistency, and I'm pushing an emphasis on both social and foreign policy, okay? And pushing the same skepticism of the left and the right. Okay? One possible risk of that is if we criticize the left and the right just as much, we don't have anybody who likes us. Not the people on the left and not the people on the right. But I don't think that's right. Okay, I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I think that actually we'll be more successful that way. Excuse me. Okay, so last set of comments. You might think that some of my suggestions, and there's lots of discussion of this issue much more generally, should suggest that we should be watering down our message. They are being more careful about our message to make it palatable more broadly. And if you think about some of the specific things I said, you should realize that's not right. I'm talking about huge rollbacks in Medicare. I'm talking about legalizing crack cocaine for 8-year-olds and stuff like that. Okay, so it's hardly a well-crafted, politically spun message. Okay? But let's talk about the question of, should libertarians water it down? My answer is, in order to be more successful, to persuade more people, my answer is absolutely not. Okay? But with some sort of caveats. Okay? So we should say, in response to our friends, to reporters, to our colleagues, we should say exactly what we think, okay, in the calmest, most rational, sort of thoughtful terms that we can. And we should say, in libertarian land, government would be really, really small, back to its level in the 90s, and we mean the 1790s. We would say that, starting from scratch, we would not advocate creating hardly any of the existing government interventions in the economy and society and foreign policy and so on. Okay? Now, why should we be so firm about that, even though it does risk alienating people on many topics? Because I think if we water it down, it makes us look like politicians. And one thing libertarians should never do is try to look like politicians, or let themselves allow to look like as politicians. First of all, our critics are going to point it out when we're inconsistent, when we're spinning it, when we're watering down. They're going to say, candidate Gary Johnson, isn't it true, candidate Johnson, that lots of libertarians think we should repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Okay? If he says no, well, he's just lying, because lots of libertarians do want to repeal the Civil Rights Act. Okay? If he says, well, yes, but I don't agree with that, then what exactly is he? Is he a libertarian, or is he not a libertarian? It puts us in a terrible position. Smart people, smart reporters will show when we are not being true to our principles. Okay? And people won't really believe it when we try to water it down or sugarcoat it anyway. So I don't think we should do that. Now, I'm not saying every libertarian has to be an anarchist, has to be all the way at every extreme. I think every libertarian should be true to whatever you personally think is right, what you believe. Okay? But I think a huge part of our brand is honesty. So don't mislead, don't sugarcoat it. Okay? Say what you honestly believe, just say it politely. Now that said, we're not starting from scratch. We're not in 1790. The existing set of attitudes is very different than it was 50 years ago or 200 years ago. The set of policies in place that everybody has sort of signed on to or sort of accepts is completely different than what we'd like it to be in libertarian land. Okay? So I do think it's okay for us to endorse partial measures, for us to talk about things which are in the right direction, even though they're not the libertarian ideal. We can talk about all sorts of ways in which it's good to have freer trade, okay, without giving up any of our principles. We don't have to just say, no, the only possible acceptable policy is complete dismantling, unilateral dismantling of all our trade barriers, even though that is what we would like. On immigration, we can say a guest worker program would be a good idea. Letting the DACA people stay would be a good idea. Okay? Expanding the H-1B quota would be a good idea. We can endorse all of these partial measures which clearly go in the direction that we want, okay, without being inconsistent with our principles. We can talk about slowing the growth of entitlements. If we made changes such as a higher age of eligibility or bigger co-pays and deductibles that cause Medicare spending to grow only at the rate of GDP instead of at 1 or 2% faster than the rate of growth of GDP, it'd be a huge improvement. Okay? It's totally fine for us to endorse that. Okay? We should not let the best be the enemy of the good. Okay? We should know when to hold them and when to fold them. We should be willing to compromise as long as it's in the direction of smaller government. And sometimes we think we should compromise for things that are not really smaller government, like accountability systems as a way to make public schools better. That's using more government to try to fix bad government. That is not a good compromise. But some other things are. So I think that our message will persuade if we are consistent, if we're honest, okay, and not from spinning. But it doesn't mean we can't talk about partial measures. We can't try to have our style be more direction which will persuade more people. Okay? As long as our compromises are thoughtful and they're in the right direction, I would certainly accept that that is okay. So let me finish with just a couple more thoughts, okay, and take questions if you're interested. I don't think we should think about libertarianism as winning. We're never going to win. It's just, it's way too hard a perspective. It's not the way most people think about policy. But we can still make a huge difference because we can nudge the other isms in our direction. We get 5% more of the electorate to think like libertarians than every single politician almost, except in dramatically Republican or dramatically Democratic districts, has to worry about trying to get the libertarian vote. And that could potentially, have an important effect on the sets of policies that mainstream politicians adopt. To get there, however, we've got to do a better job of persuading. I think we can be principled, okay, and persuasive at the same time, but that does remain to be seen because we've gotten to where we've gotten with Donald Trump as president and all the other things that we all are against, okay, and yet we don't seem to yet have found a good way to persuade more people. Okay? So I really appreciate the chance to talk to this group. It's really fun. It's really interesting. It's not what I usually do. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about this and for listening to my remarks. And I want to thank you for being libertarians. Thank you very much. Questions?
You first? You got it first, Chris.
Yeah, I wrote down your things that are good to talk about and things that are bad to talk about. What about minimum wage?
That one should be easy.
Well, yeah, it's easy for me, but is it something that,
They just have to read his blog posts on minimum wage. It lays it out pretty
No,
well.
you know.
All the lefties know they're wrong about the minimum wage.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any big, they know they're wrong. That's just the lefties currying favor with their base. So that one doesn't work me at all.
So it's not like being against Obamacare or the Fed.
My hunch is it's not. And again, I wasn't against criticizing Obamacare. I just want every sentence that criticizes Obamacare to also criticize Medicare.
There's an article in All Places of NPR a few years ago that said 5 policies that all economists agree upon but are not politically correct. Now, you're probably familiar with the article. One of them was that the corporate income tax should go to 0. I wonder if that's something you agree with, and if you could talk about excuse me, a little bit.
I do agree with it. Saying all economists agree with it is a bit of a stretch.
That was NPR's wording, not mine.
It doesn't make sense to tax things which can move easily and avoid the tax. And capital can move easily to other countries and avoid the tax. So there's at least a reasonable chance that by trying to soak it to the rich by the corporate income tax, you're actually soaking it to the working class because the jobs are going somewhere else. The demand for the services of manufacturing workers, et cetera, are moving to Malaysia or France or wherever. So lots of economists agree that at a minimum, a much lower corporate income tax is a totally sensible. Larry Summers was on Bloomberg 2 days ago saying exactly the same thing. He was worried about the effects on the deficit of just cutting the corporate income tax without doing anything else, but he completely agreed that as a matter of the structure of the tax code, a high corporate tax doesn't make sense.
I think he was first.
Okay. Behind you, John. Hi.
So I'm actually curious as to why you actually think that advocating for complete decriminalization of drugs is a hard sell. My experience is that, and this is because I've been doing drug policy activism for the last 10 years, that it's actually getting a lot easier to sell lately. And part of it is exactly what you talked about later, which is with the opioid epidemic, it's becoming very clear that criminalization is not the solution. And people are starting to realize that it actually applies not just to opioids, cannabis, but it applies to other drugs as well. You can't, if you have a problem with a drug, you can't get better if you're shamed into being underground or your very existence is criminalized.
So I would be delighted to be convinced that what you just expressed is accurate, but Jeff Sessions doesn't sound like he wants to de-escalate the drug wars. It sounds like he wants to escalate them. Governor Baker and many other states have expanded restrictions. Well, I think the politicians is to some degree doing what they think the voters want. Not exactly.
No.
80% of Americans are opposed to the United States Congress. 80%.
Okay, so let's separate these two issues for the moment. Okay, so first on what the politicians are doing, we've created these prescription drug monitoring programs in now 49 of the 50 states. Those are aimed at restricting access to opioids more. There have been additional restrictions on whether you can have a 3-week prescription versus a 6-week prescription, or how many pills you can get at a time and all that. So I think that the laws that have been adopted about opioids have gone the opposite direction of what you said. So that's why
the laws definitely have, and Jeff Sessions is part of it in old, I don't know if you're familiar with who Melvin Stembler is. Melvin Stembler is the founder of Drug Free America Foundation. Drug Free America Foundation used to be Straight Inc. Straight Inc. was a horrific, abusive drug rehab type place for kids. You know, essentially funded in part by the state through, but also endorsed by 2 sitting presidents. So there's this old guard that has sort of used the Trump thing to come back. That definitely it's taken a turn for the worse. However, among general people in talking around to people, on the ground, when you start to talk about this, it's not as hard of a sell as you think.
Okay.
A lot of people are starting to see that we're going in the wrong direction.
Okay, I would be delighted to be convinced. I have a somewhat different impression, but I will certainly pay attention. I mean, I agree there are plenty of people, such as some doctors, who are pushing hard back against additional restrictions and things like that. But since most of the policies we've adopted in the last 5 to 10 years have been for more restrictions, not fewer, it sort of makes me nervous that we're actually moving in the right direction on the opioids. And even on marijuana, Sessions is trying to use the opioid epidemic as a reason to push back against marijuana legalizations and medicalizations. So I have a less optimistic view.
Yeah, I just don't see him having as much traction among the rank and file people. Like,
So it's fair to distinguish between the people versus the politicians. In contrast to some of the comments I heard over here, I think that politicians are self-interested enough that they tend to pay some attention to what they think will get them reelected. So that there's some correlation between what voters want and what politicians advocate. But I agree, in the short term, there can definitely be noise.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll go next. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that after 1870, the average rate of growth of GDP per person was about 3% regardless of policies. And
Not per person.
I'd like to point out that between 1700 and 1850, the average GDP per person grew 4% per year during that 150 years. It was the greatest expansion ever in the history of the world in terms of an economy, and it was done with no income tax, and the average individual's property income and state tax was less than a 5% tax per person. In fact, people hardly even recognize the federal government had any role in their lives. It doesn't sound like a lot, 3 or 4%, but over a period of 150 years, that economy would be 4 times bigger than a 3% growth. So I really do think that a very limited government over a long period of time can create a huge exponential expansion in the level of an economy that we would hardly even recognize that level of growth.
So without getting too wonky,
Sure.
I totally agree that the power of compound interest.
Right.
I agree that growth may have been faster, not per capita, total growth.
No, it was per capita 4% between 1700 and 1850.
But it's still a puzzle for our view that regulation is crushing. That whether we do it, turns out whether you do it in growth rate of GDP or growth rate of GDP per capita, as regulation started to mount in the 30s especially, to some degree maybe in the progressive era, that's certainly a lot more regulation in the 30s, during the Great Depression, and then all through the post-World War II period, the growth rate just kept on at what it had been for decades before that. That doesn't suggest a major effect of regulation.
Well, you're only comparing a couple decades before the 30s or 40s, but you're ignoring the massive expansion between 17 and 1850 that makes an absolute mockery of the level of growth we had after the progressive era.
Maybe, except every standard model suggests that over time, initially an economy grows fast, and over time it tends to converge to the rate of technological progress. The US was catching up to the level of economic activity and incorporating the technology from England and the rest of Europe. So
we actually had better technology and a higher standard of living early in America versus Europe. But anyway, I don't want to get into a huge wonky discussion. I think there's a...
It's an interesting point. I will think about your point.
You can make a definite case that limited government does not significantly help.
Yeah.
Okay, so according to your Wikipedia page, it says that you hold the position of Director of Economic Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. One of my favorite presentations at the Cato Institute happened to be by Glenn Greenwald, who gave a speech on Portugal when they established a commission back in 1998 to study their drug policies, and they decriminalized all drugs, including crack cocaine, up to a 10-day supply. And that study back in 2001 had proven that they had, this happened in 2001, so we've had so many years of documented statistical data of what that effect had on their economy, the number of incarcerations, the prevalence of STDs, the number of money spent incarcerating individuals for non-violent drug crimes. So if you say politicians, right, that are supporting regulation on the war on drugs and stuff like that, are doing what they think is in the best interest of their constituents, why are less politicians? Well, you said something similar. It seemed like you were saying that, like Charlie Baker, for example, and people like that are doing what they think is in the best interest of.
No. I said, I'm not 100% sure I remember what I said. What I was trying to say was that politicians do what they think their voters want them to do.
So why is it that not enough politicians are speaking out about the statistical data that we have, where another country has already done something that solved a problem to a crisis we're facing? Why are not enough politicians?
I don't have a good answer for that. American politicians have been dramatically prohibitionist for well over 100 years.
Did you happen to see that presentation Glenn Greenwald?
I didn't see that presentation, but I certainly know that study well.
And
alas, he did it before I came to Cato, so I can't take any credit. But it's a great study. I'm not disagreeing with the study at all.
The policy changes actually improved the war on drugs as
Absolutely.
opposed to hurting it. So
Totally buy that.
So we're on the same page.
The question is, this is at some level just a question of an empirical question, whatever your views on policy are. Do politicians change their views if they think their voters in their districts have changed their views?
No.
And my guess is to a moderate degree, because they want to get reelected. I think of them as,
but like crony capitalism. I mean, do you think that exists?
You didn't read the Michael Porter paper, did you?
which Michael Porter
The one that just released on the
Okay, wait, sorry, we have several different conversations going
So,
on.
you know, on one hand, you have, okay, is the politician changing their positions because of the constituents in their area, or are they changing their positions?
Democratic senators in
capitalism?
coal states rant and rave about global warming, and we have to do all this stuff with global warming. Nevertheless, when the Clean Power Plan is on the agenda, those senators and representatives from coal states like West Virginia vote against the Clean Power Plan. Why? Because for those senators and their constituents don't like the Clean Power Plan because it's bad for their particular industries in those states. So we could argue for a long time about that empirical correlation. Do politicians respond to their voters' preferences? Okay. That aside, for whatever reason, U.S. politicians and the U.S., I think also the U.S. electorate, has had this prohibitionist, this puritanical attitude about drugs and alcohol to a much greater degree than most other countries, certainly most other developed countries, for a long time. We created worldwide prohibition in 1919. At the end of World War I, Paris, at the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. said it wasn't going to sign the treaty ending World War I unless every other country agreed to outlaw drugs. What did outlawing drugs have to do with ending World War I? But the U.S. had gotten this bug up its ass, pardon me, my French, and there were some very hardcore prohibitionists in the administration, and they put this in this, and we have tried to foist prohibition on every other country. There's incorporated UN treaties, of which the U.S. was the big advocate, and so on. So I don't know why the U.S. has such a different attitude than Portugal, except to say it's gone on for a long, long time.
According to Glenn, though, he actually said that the reason Portugal didn't legalize all drugs was because it would violate those very treaties.
That's right.
with the United States.
And because the way the treaties are written is you can decriminalize without violating the treaties, but you can't legalize without violating the treaties.
Let's get some other questions.
Do you think that we are too focused on data and I guess more economics and not on the field, or more of a moral arguments? So for instance, like Social Security, Medicare, those things I think need to be talked about more, no?
I think that it doesn't matter. I think first, different people came to their libertarian views in different ways. Okay, some people read Ayn Rand and it really spoke to them. When I read Ayn Rand, I fall asleep.
Wow.
I literally cannot read the book. I cannot get past page 10. It's just, to me, super, super, super boring. It's just not. Atlas Shrugged.
Have you read Anthem?
No, I haven't tried it. I've read various essays. I've gotten through about a third of the Fountainhead. But I just don't find it to be good writing. And I also find her to be sort of an authoritarian. Her view is everybody should do exactly what I think is right, period. That doesn't seem very libertarian to me. But if that's what made you a libertarian, great. If economics made you a libertarian, great. If something else made you... I think they're different languages for the same conclusions. The rights-based libertarians come to more or less exactly the same conclusions as the economic or consequential libertarians. So at some level, they must be using the same arguments. So I don't have any view on that one way or the other. I happen to be an economist, so I tend to think in terms of data and consequences, but I think respecting liberty and respecting economic efficiency or individual choice or utility maximization, they all lead you to exactly the same conclusion. So amongst ourselves, we shouldn't fight about it. And when we talk to, I'm sure we do, but when we talk to other people, you should use the language that you think will be persuasive with the audience you happen to be talking to.
The left, I think, is very much moral and very philosophical and very feely and touchy and all of that. Because they always say, oh, you're going to like kill my grandpa or like kill my poor person or anything like that. So I think we need to.
And we can answer that in multiple ways, which is that if you bankrupt the entire economy by having an excessively generous entitlement state, you're going to kill everybody's grandpa. So how does that make any sense?
I agree.
That's 20 years from now.
Quick thing. So that gentleman over there asked about GDP growth. Could you talk about, I guess, more how that is kind of, well, it's a bit wonky, I know, but in terms of econ, how GDP is a very, I think a very poor measure because it can be kind of convoluted with government spending, investment spending. It's a very big aggregate that isn't entirely tangled.
I'm less negative about it than some people, but it leaves out some crucial things, such as leisure. So GDP has grown by some amount since 1900. We're producing that amount of GDP with far fewer hours per person working than we did. So that's a huge improvement in our welfare in most people's view. Other things equal, if you have more leisure time in which to consume your goods and services, you have a better material well-being. GDP leaves out underground activities like drugs and prostitution, activities where there's tax evasion, but it still seems to correlate pretty well with almost any measure you would think is a useful measure. So that's why I think just throwing it out is probably not quite, it's probably excessive.
So I guess I'm kind of critical of it because if you look at regulation during the 1930s, that increased a lot with sort of government spending.
No. Most regulation has almost no effect on government spending. You have a bureau, you have this Federal Trade Commission. It employs 200 people. Say each person is getting $100,000 in compensation plus benefits. That's nothing. That is rounding error on rounding error on rounding error. What led to a lot of extra spending is the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So all that regulation had almost no effect on government spending. Now, it may have done lots of bad things, but it didn't show up in government spending accounts. So that's why I don't think that GDP is a terrible measure. It's an okay measure.
That's another question.
Yeah.
This is a friendly question. I mean,
now I'm in trouble.
Yeah, sometimes when I talk to people on Facebook and from other countries, I immediately look up their GDP per person. I think, oh, that country, $8,000 per person. The United States, $53,000. Wouldn't you maybe be able to make a claim that the GDP per person measurement between countries is some broad measure of economic freedom, perhaps?
I would certainly say, empirically, it correlates really well with economic freedom. The various people who created these indices of economic freedom, of the number of laws and number of restrictions, they find that the rich countries are the ones who have the best scores on these measures of economic freedom. And a little bit more deeply, I think if people are allowed to choose where they want to work, what their profession is, whom they marry, how much education to get, and they're allowed to make all their own choices, that leads to a more efficient economy and shows up in higher GDP per capita. So that goes back to the earlier question. I don't want to get into arguments about rights versus economic or consequentialist. I think they lead you to the same answers.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the favorite conversations that libertarians like to have is about intellectual property and how intellectual property doesn't exist without the government. Is there any evidence that government protection of intellectual property leads to increased output?
There's not much. There are a bunch of studies of different countries that had different rules about intellectual property, or some countries where some industries were subject to the standard patent or other intellectual property rules, and other industries for some historical accident were not. Various other comparisons. They find basically no effect, not not 100%. They find mainly no effect on the rate of production of new ideas, of new patents, of new technologies, and the rate of innovation. The exceptions in the literature is pharmaceuticals and chemistry a little bit more broadly. There, it does seem that patent protection has an effect on generating more new products. Okay? Now, more new products is not necessarily all, that much better, because lots of the new medicines are teeny tweaks on previous medicines. They're an attempt to extend your patent protection and crowd out generics and things like that. So based on, all social science evidence should be taken with many grains of salt. But up to the limits of social science evidence, there's not strong evidence that patent protection is useful in terms of spurring innovation. So I think libertarians could be okay with no particular strong affection for such laws. Yeah?
So if I was to distill the first half of the comments, libertarians are essentially pissing up the world because we have 1,000 things that we want to argue with each other about. We come across essentially as callous assholes, Republicans and Democrats. There's not a single thing that we can do that's going to change or something and hopefully move everyone towards liberty, which is essentially what the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance tries to do. I, however, have a different thought. There's been discussion post Las Vegas about requiring a constitutional convention of the states. And while I realize this could mean that we outlaw firearms and abortion because it's sausage making, I would go as a libertarian against one particular clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which then allows government to say, just make the rules. I'm establishing Jim as the head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I'm putting Siobhan as the head of the Bureau of Drug Enforcement, and you guys make up whatever rules you want to, and you're pretty much immune to the whims or the feelings of the electorate, which is where you're saying to me, Sessions says this, and certain other people, but the state's attorney generals feel separate and different from Attorney General Sessions. But he is of the ilk of the Necessary and Proper Clause. I'm so insulated as an appointee, basically have to depose the president to depose me.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure what the question was.
Let's get to a point where we stop enabling legislation, and if we were to do one thing as libertarians, we should attack the idea of the Necessary and Proper Clause because it subverts the idea of representative democracy.
So, I'm not an expert on the Constitution. I like the Constitution. I think that if we interpret it the way I read it, the way I think it was meant to be read, it would be quite libertarian. But I'm also nervous that relying on constitutional or other institutional fixes for fundamental problems end up not being very effective. Balanced budget amendments or limited spending amendments or term limits. I think that when public opinion doesn't really support what we're trying to accomplish with those things, they end up not working. That's just my empirical assessment. Now, but let me come back to your question a little bit closer, okay? Which is, if you interpret the Necessary and Proper Clause as can make such laws as are necessary and proper for the carrying out of only its legitimate functions, then I don't think that by itself it does any damage. What does the damage is that we threw out other parts of the Constitution, or we amended it in ways we shouldn't even been able to amend it by allowing the banning of liquor. Okay, so if there's no basis for any law which restricts people's drug use, then passing laws that are necessary and proper to enforce a law against drug use, it never arises because those, the Controlled Substances Act just shouldn't have ever been allowed at all. Anything which is inconsistent with the original meaning of the Commerce Clause shouldn't have been allowed at all, so we don't have to argue about what's necessary and proper for the enforcement of these non-constitutional policies. Things are non-constitutional in the first place.
However, they waive Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and say, we can touch anything at any time, at any place, and I can appoint the head of the agency, and essentially it's a new appointment.
I mean, I agree they do that, and they make that kind of assertion all the time. I'm totally with you. And that's part of my view that if we simply try to rely on constitutional restraints, we're never effective, because when people want to ram through those constitutional constraints, they do so. So we have to focus on convincing people that those ramming throughs are bad ideas. Otherwise, we'll never.
Which is my point. If you're going to be an ineffective libertarian, be an ineffective libertarian in Clause 18. This shall not endure.
Point taken.
It's all right, George. I don't deal with that at all.
So I would like to thank Dr. Miron for